Right. Got it. Okay.
Got it.
Got it. All right. So, as I mentioned, Rabbi Alexandra Shuval-Weiner is with us tonight. She is the senior rabbi of Temple Beth Tikvah in Roswell. She's originally from the other coast, from Los Angeles, and then studied in Israel and Kansas, and has spent most of her career in the western half of the US, including Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, California, and Oregon. Prior to rabbinical school, she worked in Jewish education. She is now the third senior rabbi at Beth Tikvah. She's been with the congregation since 2015, and in her time in Atlanta has joined a number of different boards in the community. So, Rabbi, if you would like to start, that would be great.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so nice being with you all this evening. I will tell you that I am much more comfortable standing in a room, engaging with people one-on-one. Like all of us, I've learned to use Zoom, but I learned to change my name. I've learned to put on a fancy background, but in terms of all of the bells and whistles, I'm still pretty much a novice. So with that, I do apologize that I will be delivering more of a lecture for the first portion, and then we'll sort of open up for conversation. I don't have slides to share because I don't know how to do them. So I hope you will bear with me, and feel free, if you're more comfortable having your camera off while I talk at you, and then we can all open our cameras and have a conversation. So our topic is anti-Semitism this evening. And I want to give you some background for our conversation. Prior to coming to Roswell, I served as the associate rabbi to a very large Reform congregation in Overland Park, Kansas. On April 13th of 2014, a man drove to the Jewish Community Center of Greater Kansas City and opened fire. He murdered 2 people, and then he continued a half-mile down the road to Village Shalom, a Jewish retirement community, where he shot 3 more people, one of whom perished. Thankfully, our religious school had dismissed by that time the first shots, by the time the first shots were fired, because my synagogue was just across the street and we were on the man's list. The gunman was a 73-year-old man who was arrested, and when he was stopped, he was screaming, he was here to rid the world of Jews. He was subsequently tried and convicted of murder and other crimes and sentenced to death. Miller was a former Klansman. He was a neo-Nazi, and he was a former political candidate. He ended up dying in prison in 2021 while awaiting his execution. In a press conference, the FBI stated that it was determined that the motivation for the shooting was due to anti-Semitism. Several items were seized from his home in Aurora, Missouri, which included 3 boxes of ammunition, a red shirt with a swastika, anti-Semitic publications, which included copies of the protocols to the elders of Zion and Mein Kampf, and directions to all of the area synagogues, which also included a printout of an event that was taking place that day at the community center, which is why he drove there. While my college-aged kids were home for Passover, they were at the JCC that day. Thankfully, my children came home. The killer was out for Jews. Ironic, which just still doesn't feel like the right word, but all of the people that he ended up murdering were Christians. They were members of a local church, a mother, a grandfather, and his 13-year-old grandson. These were the victims of this man's hate. Now, over the past few years, we have witnessed several violent anti-Semitic crimes in the United States. Murders in synagogues, at a kosher grocery store, at a Hanukkah party, as well as physical attacks on Orthodox and other visible Jews, the desecration of cemeteries, anti-Semitic imagery that we saw at the January 6th Capitol attack, the January 15th hostage taking in Colleyville, Texas, in which the attacker thought that by taking Jews hostage in a synagogue and speaking with the chief rabbi of America, he could force the United States government's hand, is yet another terrifying example. And we know that this will not be the last. In the past year, according to the Anti-Defamation League, there have been over 2,100 acts of assault, vandalism, and harassment, the highest on record since the ADL began tracking anti-Semitic attacks in the United States in 1979. These incidents and others have generated a new public conversation about anti-Semitism. And I would assume this is in part of the reason that this topic was chosen by your study group for this evening. So what is anti-Semitism? The word itself gets thrown around with very little context. At its core, it is simply anti-Jewish bigotry in the form of racism against the Jewish people. Some of the confusion around anti-Semitism stems from the fact that Jews don't fit neatly into one category. Although generally considered a religion, Judaism is much more. The classic Hebrew term for Jews is Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. And this conveys a sense of peoplehood that is of belonging to a nation with a history, a belief system, a sacred language, a connection to one another, and a historic homeland. Jews come from many races and ethnicities, and we have many subcultures with unique traditions and languages. One who converts to Judaism becomes a member of this people, no less than someone who is born as Jewish. At its core, anti-Semitism sees Jews as a nefarious and corrupting presence within society. And this hatred originated in antiquity as anti-Judaism and evolved into a modern political ideology that blurs race and religion and sometimes takes the form of conspiracy theories. Anti-Semitism draws on a pool of stories and tropes about Jews that gets pulled to the surface at different times in different places by different people for different reasons and with different impacts. Some of the most common false and destructive anti-Semitic tropes in this pool include the following. Power. Jews control the world. These claims suggest that the Jews are all powerful. We are the secret puppet masters behind the scenes of world events, as popularized by the early 20th century anti-Semitic forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That we control the media, financial institutions, and the government. There are also conspiracy theories that Jews cause diseases, pandemics, wars, or other disasters. We've been blamed for causing the Black Death in the medieval period. In 2017 in Saudi Arabia, it was claimed that the Jews sent AIDS-infected melons via an underground passageway into their country that caused an AIDS epidemic. And some have accused the Jewish people or the state of Israel of creating and spreading COVID-19. There are tropes of Jewish greed, claims that Jews love money, that this brings it all back around to that control of the world financial system. I remember when I was 8 years old, I was followed home from elementary school by some older boys who threw pennies at me and called me a dirty Jew. I didn't even know what that meant. The claim of disloyalty. The idea that Jews are untrustworthy and or disloyal, or that Jews are more loyal to Israel or to world Jewry than to their own country of citizenship. In 2019, when President Trump said that American Jews who chose to vote for Democrats were being disloyal, he was flirting with that notion that has fueled anti-Semitism for generations and has been at the root of some of the most brutal violence inflicted upon the Jewish community. The accusation is that Jews have a dual loyalty, that we are not to be trusted because our true allegiance is to our religion rather than to the country in which we live. If one looks into biblical history, you will find this trope appears often, and it is used to justify our extermination. If you read the book of Exodus, it opens with the idea that Pharaoh looked out and saw the Hebrews as other, and we could rise up against Egypt. As such, we were to be subjugated. And next week, we celebrate the holiday of Purim in the book of Esther. In that book itself, again, Hitler, the evil megalomaniac, is the one who controls King Ahasuerus by telling him, see those people, they are other, they could rise up against you. And with that, he was given permission to send out the edict to destroy the Jewish community. In modern history, this is the ideology that animated the Nazis in the 1930s of Germany, when they accused Jewish people of being traitors and used charges of disloyalty to justify arrests, persecutions, and later mass killing. And then there's the trope of evil. We Jews are often caricatured with horns or a long hook nose that represents evil, deception, or manipulation. Claims that Jews are in league with the devil, or that Jews drink blood or kill babies to make our matzah. In William Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, as a former literature major in college and a lover of Shakespeare, to see the character of Shylock, a financier who is repeatedly referred to as, quote, the devil in the likeness of a Jew. And then there are the modern anti-Semites, such as Louis Farrakhan, who regularly demonizes the Jewish people as satanic. While anti-Semitism is a modern term, the hatred of Jews has deep historical roots. The associations connecting Israelites, disloyalty, and plague have origins as far back as ancient Egypt, as early as the 14th century BCE. Early Christians, needing to explain why Jews remained Jewish after the coming of Jesus, further developed anti-Jewish ideas, including associations between Jews and the devil. There is a famous picture of Michelangelo of Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments, with beams coming from his head. Beams are cut short and sometimes are interpreted to be horns. If we look at the Hebrew text, the word for keren or, the beams of light that we read about, that when Moses, after having had that intimate engagement with God up on Mount Sinai, when God's presence passes before Moses while he is protected in that niche in the mountain cliff. But he comes back and he's beaming, he's radiating, and he has to cover himself because the experience of being in God's presence is so intense. But that word, keren, shares the same three root as karnaim, which are horns. And that misinterpretation gets used to justify that Jews, in fact, do have horns. I can't tell you how many times as a child, school children would come up touching my head and asking, where are your horns? So embedded. The Roman Empire's adoption of Christianity in the 14th century CE brought anti-Judaism from the realm of Christian doctrine to the legal institutional sphere, with severe consequences throughout the medieval era, including outbursts of intense violence. European Jews in the Middle Ages faced occupational restrictions and prohibitions on owning land, which pushed many into portable occupations necessary to the European economic elite, such as money lending and trade. We have to remember usury laws within the church were such that one could not charge interest of another member of the church. And so the Jewish community was often utilized as that middleman for the purposes of both the church and the elites. Elites set up Jews as these middlemen in roles like tax collector, mediating between the presence and the sovereign. And this led to Jews being closely identified with money. How many of us love the IRS guy down the street? Jews were scapegoated for diseases, as I've mentioned before, like the Black Plague. Jews were denied basic political and civil rights in most countries and accused often with deadly consequences of murdering Christian children. During the Middle Ages, Jewish communities, wholly dependent on the suffrage of rulers, were expelled from multiple countries. The Crusades massacred many Jews on their way to the Holy Land. And there are writings that say that the streets of Jerusalem were knee-deep with Jewish blood. Spanish blood purity laws of the 15th century marked Jews forced to convert to Catholicism during the Inquisition and their descendants as separate from the rest of the true church. And this introduced a racialized understanding of Jews that persisted for generations. Anti-Semitism as a modern ideology emerged in German-speaking Central Europe in the late 19th century. You see, because of the Enlightenment, Jews became emancipated legally, socially, and politically. And the devices that had separated the Jewish community from the rest of society began to be dismantled. The walls of the ghettos came down, so to speak, which brought down the barriers that had segregated the Jews. For anti-Semites, this raised the sphere of Jews mixing their nefarious ways into Christian society. German pamphleteer William Marr popularized the term anti-Semitism.
This meeting is being recorded.
In the 1870s to give his Jew hatred and rejection of Jewish societal integration a modern secular veneer distinct from religious anti-Judaism. It was a pseudoscientific classification entitled Semites. Anti-Semitism always refers to Jews, despite the fact that there are multiple Semitic languages: Arabic, Aramaic, the language of Jesus. These are Semitic languages, just as Hebrew is. Throughout history, bursts of violence have cut through long stretches when Jewish communities thrived in mutual relationship with their neighbors. The Holocaust, of course, was the most destructive episode of anti-Semitism in history. The Nazi Party gave political expression to radicalized theories of anti-Semitism. Their ideology, particularly the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, that Jews were responsible for communism, took root across Europe, enabling broader public participation in genocide. The Nazis exterminated 6 million Jews, about 2/3 of the European Jewish population. And this ongoing collective trauma lends additional urgency to conversations around contemporary anti-Semitism. I want to address a little bit of anti-Semitism outside of Christian Europe. Now, Jews have lived under Muslim rule in the Middle East and North Africa for centuries as one minority group among many, with a set of rights and restrictions associated with their status as protected non-Muslim monotheists. Jews paid special taxes, and in sometimes in places, though not the majority, had to live only in designated areas or wear distinctive clothing. While sporadic acts of violence and forced conversions occurred, Overall, Jews generally enjoyed the stability of a legal regime that afforded the community the right to live freely as Jews. Though Islam does include beliefs and stories about Jews being considered inferior or untrustworthy, these never became foundational like they did in Christian Europe. The situation, however, changed in the 19th century, in large part due to European imperial expansion, which brought with it European anti-Semitism that combined with existing Islamic traditions. In the 20th century, Zionism, perceived in the Arab world as linked with Western colonialism, exacerbated tensions. Many Muslim majority countries began adopting anti-Jewish measures. Most Jews either left these homelands, some willingly, and some by expulsion, some under duress after their property was confiscated, and many immigrating from the Arab world to Israel or to other European countries or to South America. The country of Yemen, which is in the southernmost tip of the Saudi Arabian continent, was one of the first nations to be converted by Muhammad's followers in the 7th century CE. Yet the Jewish community there had dated to before the 2nd century. There was in Yemen something called the Orphans Decree. It mandated the forced conversion of Jewish orphans to Islam, and an orphan was considered if either both parents perished or just the father. So even if the mother was still alive, the child was forcibly taken away, converted, and often put into servitude into a Muslim home. Now, I share this because my sons are Yemenite on their father's side. Their great-grandmother, who was born in Sana'a, became orphaned at the age of 10. In order to protect her and to circumvent this decree, she was married off, and the young couple then walked across the desert, up the peninsula to settle in biblical Judea or British mandated Palestine. My sons are here today because of the bravery of their great-grandparents, these children who fled what would have been a forced conversion or something else. So I appreciate the ability to digress with that personal narrative. Now, so let's back to the focus on anti-Semitism and how it's manifested itself in the United States. So while the Declaration of Independence and Constitution espouse a commitment to equality and justice, the founding documents established a hierarchy that put white Christian men at the top. As such, anti-Semitism is woven into society just like structural racism, though it has looked different at different moments in history. From America's earliest days, white-appearing Jews were allowed to own property, and Jewish men could enjoy full citizenship. At the same time, Jews also faced public discrimination, which included legal restrictions in some state constitutions and quotas in higher education. In 1924, the US restricted immigration from Europe to reduce Jewish influx. Restrictive covenants in housing and restrictions on lending in certain neighborhoods targeted both Jews and Blacks. The American First Movement of the 1940s and McCarthyism in the 1950s targeted Jews as a dangerous left-wing threat. However, after the Second World War, Jewish veterans were able to access the benefits of the GI Bill, including college tuition and home loans. This bill, one of the most significant wealth creators for white Americans, helped to move Jews with European heritage to a higher rung on the racial ladder. White Jews today benefit from the privileges of whiteness, but this whiteness is conditional. A white Jew may not worry about being shot by police during a traffic stop, but can be gunned down while at prayer in a synagogue. Jews who are more recognizable as Jews, including the black hat Orthodox, or those of us who wear kippot in public, yarmulkes, are more vulnerable. Today, a significant and growing percentage of US Jews identify as Jews of color, such as my sons. And like all people of color, they are targets of racism, and as Jews are targets of anti-Semitism. Just as racism, sexism, ableism, and other prejudices exist among people of all political persuasions, anti-Semitism too can flare up from any direction. Certain varieties, however, are worth noting. In its most extreme form, white dominant culture spawns far-right ideologies with anti-Semitism at their core. The Great Replacement theory blames Jews for the migration of people of color to countries that, per white nationalists, rightly belong to white people. The man who went on his shooting rampage in Overland Park, the men who murdered Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh and at the Chabad Center in Poway, California, as well as the participants in the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, all subscribe to this ideology. Elements of the Great Replacement theory have now entered mainstream discourse and have been cited by politicians and pundits. Another variation is called, comes out of the Christian evangelical movement called philo-Semitism, which fetishizes Jews and Jewish practices and promotes an end times vision in which Jews and Judaism will ultimately disappear. And then the other end of the spectrum, we have left-wing anti-Semitism, which can refer to several different phenomena. Sometimes anti-capitalist ideologies draw on negative anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews and money to equate Jews with a capitalist system, or focus excessively on Jewish CEOs, despite there being a minority in the corporate world. Other times, criticism of Israel can cross over into anti-Semitism. The Anti-Defamation League's 2020 audit of anti-Semitism, the most recent data available, cataloged 331 incidences involving right-wing extremist groups or individuals inspired by them. In contrast, 119 incidences involved progressive criticism of Israel or Jews in certain spaces. Anti-Semitism Anti-Semitism often does not fit neatly into left-right political categories, as evident, for instance, in gender stereotypes such as the frigid Jewish woman, the Jap, the Jewish American princess, or the emasculated Jewish man. Finally, in urban neighborhoods that were heavily Jewish before white flight, such as Harlem or parts of Brooklyn, or where the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox communities, never left, Jews continued to own buildings and businesses, often making Jews the face of whiteness to the Black communities living there. The resulting economic and social pressures have led to anti-Semitism that is not inherently political. Finally, let me talk a bit about criticism of Israel. The land of Israel has been the historic Jewish homeland from the time of the Bible. The Roman destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE ended Jewish sovereignty there. Since then, the Jewish community, scattered throughout the world, continued to pray daily for a return to Jerusalem and to mourn its destruction. In the 19th century context of ethnic minorities seeking national rights and despair about Jews' safety and ability to flourish in Europe, the Zionist movement worked for a Jewish return to Israel. Following World War I, the region came under British colonial control, and this was followed by Ottoman control. Preceded by Ottoman control. After years of negotiations, tensions, and bloodshed by multiple sides, and in the wake of the Holocaust, the UN voted in 1947 to partition the region into a Jewish state and Palestinian state living side by side. The regional war that followed displaced more than 800,000 Jews from Arab countries and 700 Arabs, many of Palestinian descent, in the event known by the Palestinians as the Nakba and by Israelis as the War of Independence. During the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel captured the West Bank, the area that we know as Gaza, and parts of East Jerusalem. Like any other country, Israel is subject to criticism of some of its governmental policies and human rights records. Confusion between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism arises because of Israel's self-identification as a Jewish state, claims by some Israeli leaders to speak on behalf of world Jewry, and the fact that 47% of Jews live in Israel, and historical trauma that leads many Jews to hear attacks on Israel as a personal safety threat. Zionist. Zionist means a love of Zion, the biblical reference to the land of Israel. By perverting the term Zionism and libelously associating it with racism, apartheid, and colonialism, some have found a politically correct way to attack Jews as Zionists. Around 95% of all Jews are Zionists. We are Jews who support our own liberation, and the attacks on us play on the same tropes that are employed directly against our community. As the late Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King said, quote, "When people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews, and you are talking anti-Semitism," unquote. Defining anti-Semitism in 2005, in response to rising anti-Semitism and racism, the European Union's Anti-Racism Agency created a working definition of anti-Semitism for the purpose of monitoring and combating anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic discrimination and violence. This definition, adopted in 2016 by the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, IHRA, became known as the IHRA definition, which is presently being discussed in the Georgia legislature as we speak. I'm going to stop there because I've been talking for a really long time. So I'm going to stop there. We can talk about what has arisen locally in our community here. And I hope by the end of our time together, we can talk about ways in which your community might consider becoming allies. So with that, let me, like I said, stop talking at you and let's talk together.
I have a question, or an observation rather, Rabbi.
Yes.
It appears as if there are some Christian communities that are fervent supporters of Israel, but not in love with Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Can you address that and explain the dichotomy here?
I will try. There is a teaching, and I apologize up front in making assumptions about different sects within Christianity. But I've been taught that there are some within the Christian community who, as part of theological understanding, that until the Jewish community accepts Jesus Christ as Savior, that Jesus cannot return. And so there, in some churches, there's a great love of Jews, a support of Israel to bring Jews back to Israel for what would then become the Great Conversion, which, as I mentioned, I touched on very briefly in my comments before, that once that conversionary process would happen, Judaism would cease because we would be born again into the appropriate faith, which then would hearken the return of the Messiah, bringing all of the events that would follow at that moment. So that is more of an idea of needing to strengthen Christianity, to strengthen the coming of Jesus, as opposed to a desire to be in relationship with the Jewish community. So we hold this over here, which then when one is dealing with Jews per se, we fall into then those categories of the tropes. What's wrong with the Jew? Why aren't we following suit? Why aren't we doing what we're supposed to be doing? Why aren't we following in line? And that's because we've made the pact with the devil. That's because we're out to corrupt Christians and stop Jesus from returning. That's because we're really money grubbing, and that's our God. So you have these beliefs that sort of play into one another, and the idea that that God is so much greater than all of us, and that we all understand God from the lens that we need to understand God, is not held by those of this ideology. I think that's the best that I can respond to with that, Carlton.
And this is very alive and well. I'm looking at something that a neighbor of mine sent to me back in September, a letter that was left on doors, mailboxes in the East Cobb community back in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, it's well, you can't see that at all to see what it looked like, but it says, we would like to invite you and your community to return to the promised land. Isaiah 4:9-22 beckons your return, and it beckons us to assist you as needed. Please consider the time we are presently in. So I mean, that was in September of this year in the community where I live. So very alive and well.
It's interesting because that letter was going around. There were two letters going around. There was one that was like really an anti-Semitic letter. And then this one sort of was, it depended on the reader, on how they took it. Was this anti-Semitic, or was this just somebody out of love, out of from their lens of love of what can we do to help you get back to the land? That one was kind of iffy, was that part of that idea that we need you to go back to the land so Jesus can come? Or was it really a heartfelt, this is your Jewish homeland, you should be able to be there, what can we do to help you? So that one, like I said, I think it really depended on the person how they received the message. And we don't know who the writer was to determine really what was in your heart when you were offering those words. Simultaneously, there were some true letters that were being found in California, Florida, and made its way into the Atlanta area that were full-on hate-filled anti-Semitic statements that were put out to cause pain and distress.
I had a question.
Hal, hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good, good. Thank you for coming. We appreciate you for coming to speak with us. I think we are aware of the complexity. Somebody's got their mail.
That's me, sorry.
Yeah, bye.
I don't know how to turn it off.
They're trying to figure out if your extended car warranty needs to be renewed. That's all that is. But we see that there's some complexity involved when looking at the situation in Israel with Gaza, the West Bank, Palestinians. And I see oftentimes when the discussions come up, it gets instantly heated because people are just kind of one side or the other.
Right.
But it's a complicated issue, because you want to root for the Palestinians, but you also know that their leadership, they're kind of under leadership who has decided that let's drop some bombs and launch some missiles, and the people get caught up in that. So with how that's going on, and on the other hand, some people have issue with settlements built by Israel as they go deeper into that territory. So looking at the complexities of that issue, what's the take of the local community, local Jewish community, rabbis like yourself and others? Because I'm fairly certain y'all discuss these issues. So not trying to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious. And it is a safe space, so say whatever. But I'm just curious as to what you guys discuss when you give some insight on what you guys discuss. And now I'll shut up and listen.
No, that's a really, really great and important question. Thank you for asking it. So it's a very complicated, sticky conversation to have. First of all, the Jewish community is not unified on the Palestinian-Israeli question. There are those in the community who tend to be much more on the very Orthodox side, that that the idea is that Judea and Samaria, the totality of the land of Israel, was part of the covenant with God and the Jewish people, and that our Messiah can't come until the Jewish people are fully in the land and are and have rebuilt the temple and all of those aspects of the situation. So in those conversations, there's only a one-state solution, and that's what it is. On the other side of the community, there are many Jews who tend to be on more of the every word is so full of complicated. Yeah. So I'm going to say liberal progressive side, but again, that, those are charged words as well. We're on the side who say, again, God is bigger than all of us. God gave us the world. We are supposed to share the world. We need to it's much more important for us to find paths to peace. And if that means that we need that in Israel, we need to give up certain land so that the Palestinian peoples can have land so that they can live in sovereignty and they can raise their children in peace, then that is exactly what we need to be working towards and fighting towards. And then there are people right in the middle of all of that. Those conversations go on all the time. There are many organizations that are social justice organizations. There's one organization in particular that is made up of rabbis from around the world, across the denominations, that are on the ground working in Israel, working on behalf of forging these paths of peace. And those, and people on the other side are calling those of us on that side, yes, I am on that side, calling us out as, not being, truly righteously Jewish. So, and it's complicated. Many of us are challenged by how do we speak to our congregations, because our congregations are so divided politically, not just in this country, but on what's going on in Israel. So where the sort of the anti-Semitism piece comes in as well, is where the those of us who are allies of justice and peace will often enter into certain progressive circles, but because of anti-Semitism are pushed out of those circles. So when we get into issues of sort of cross-pollination and working on breaking down certain structures, and we get pushed out of those spaces. So you can't even necessarily have conversations. So like the Women's March, for instance, there were many Jews that were involved in the foundation of the Women's March, but then there became a breakdown within that of the sense of that if certain people didn't demand that Israel cease being a Jewish state, even though we were fighting for Palestinian rights, again, we were pushed out of those spaces. So it becomes extremely complicated to have the conversation within our own community, as well as have the conversation in ally communities or communities that we thought were allies, because of ideologies of colonialism and other, I'm going to use tropes, because I do believe they are tropes that are used. I mean, all of us, we're all living on stolen land. We are all living on the land of the indigenous peoples. Right here in Roswell, I believe this is the enchanted land, and the same voices that are demanding that Jews leave Israel and don't have a right to be in conversation with trying to create a two-state solution don't say anything about the fact we need to be dealing with our country here as well. We need to be having these same conversations here. So it's messy and it gets ugly, and but we have to keep pushing through. We keep needing to find people with whom we can have conversations with. There are a lot of people on the ground in Israel and in Palestine that are having the hard conversations, that are doing the hard work. And unfortunately, too many people outside look at everything as being black and white. There's no gray, there's no room for how you create negotiated conversation and really building trust to have partners to create what the future needs to be. The idea of Palestine pushing out all the Jews, from the river to the sea, that's not going to happen unless we go to a major war. Jews taking all of the land and just keep pushing the settlements, that can't happen. We have to find a way to live in mutual agreement. We have much bigger issues. We've got climate issues. We've got bigger issues that we need to put aside and focus on the humanitarian needs of this world as a whole. So I don't know if I answered your question, because it's just so complicated how.
You did. And I guess what I was going to say, because I realized my question was kind of open-ended, it didn't tie back completely to the topic, but you kind of hit on it, was since we're learning from you about the different tropes in anti-Semitism, is there a way to have conversations about these things without somebody yelling and saying, you're being anti-Semitic?
Yeah.
Is there some certain way to address those things or criticisms of Israel without
Yeah.
being called that? Or is it just one of those things you just know, depending on the audience, they're either going to say it or they're going to accept it or they aren't?
You know, I think there's always that sense of, I can tickle my husband and that's okay, but I can't, you know, tickle the neighbor next door, because that's not okay. And sometimes the conversation comes down to, you know, you should be able to criticize Israel as a country, just as we criticize lots of other countries, as we criticize our own nation. We should be able to do that without it seeping into double standards. Israel is consistently held to a much higher standard than any other country in the world. Israel is criticized, and yes, Israel has human rights issues. Yes, I will say it. I'm not in love with a lot of things that the Israeli government does. But I should be able to talk about that in the same way that I can talk about structural racism in this country, structural racism in other countries. But to say that Israel is being held for crimes against humanity, when we know that's going on in China, we know that's going on in Russia, we know that's going on in other places, and it's not, and the conversation isn't on the same playing field, that's when it falls over into anti-Semitism. And more to your point on, is there a way to sit down? Yes, there are ways to sit down, but unfortunately, our country has gotten to a level that it's very difficult to have a conversation about anything. We are so far apart because of, and left, right, center, I don't care what any of our politics are, we lost a lot of traction over the last number of years. And it's going to take a lot of work to build trust, to be able to sit down, to have those crucial conversations without everyone feeling attacked. And that becomes part of the problem. We've got to be able to sit and talk and build trust in order to sit down and have the hard conversations. Because if everybody comes with their hackles up, you can't go anywhere. So, Sue, you've had your hand up for a really long time, and then I see Carol, you have your hand up as well.
Oh, good evening, Rabbi. Thanks for your wonderful insight. Can you tell me what is a Palestinian? I've been confused about that for years. I don't find any. Can you give me just a short, specific definition, please? Thank you. Or not so specific.
Again, I am an other addressing a group of people that would give you a different answer than I would. But as I understand, first of all, my in-laws, the people who walked from Yemen, they were Palestinian because they immigrated to Palestine, which was a term that was created by Rome during the time when previously the country was known as Judea. So after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, you all call AD, when Rome sacked Jerusalem, burned the temple, took it over, whatever Jews actually did survive and weren't taken into slavery, those that were still living in the land became called Palestina.
Palestina, yes.
Palestine. The Palestinian people of Israel today, many of whom suggest that they come from the lineage of the Canaanites, who were in the land during the biblical period before Abraham, who heard God's call to go to the land that I will show you, entered the land. There were many cultural groups living in the land at that time. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. In 1948, when Israel became independent, and the British Mandate divided and created two areas. One that was called Medinat Israel, the state of Israel, and the other that was retained the name of Palestine, that the British used as the normative name for the area. So all those peoples who were of Arab descent, who were living in the land at that time, were called Palestinian. And I have to add one more sort of geopolitical piece. Jordan, which had a kingdom maintained while many of those Palestinian people also lived in Jordan. When Israel became independent in 48, Jordan pushed out many of the Palestinians that were in their area, so that the ruling kingdom did not have a Palestinian majority. So many of them were sent into the borders of Israel. So the definition of what is a Palestinian, we're working off of today, the people who reside in the land of Israel within the West Bank and within Gaza. I think that's the best that I can offer right now. If you were to sit with my friend Nabil, he would probably give you a different answer to that.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you
Carol,
very
you had your hand up for a question? Carol Maddox.
Yes, I did. Thanks. So thank you, Rabbi Alex, for all the information you've shared with us tonight. And I wanted to also remember that we have a special history, your congregation and St. David's, that goes back to the beginning of Temple Beth Tikvah. And so, your congregation gave us our beautiful round window of the 12 tribes of Israel that we enjoy every Sunday. And some of us enjoy even in between Sundays. So kind of getting back to your talk about allies, how can we rekindle those ties and be a really good ally? I mean, specifically, how can St. David's and Temple Beth Tikvah come together in North Fulton and East Cobb and be good allies together?
Thank you for that. And I must come and see the stained glass window, because I have heard so much about it. And our founding rabbi, our Rabbi Emeritus, Rabbi Donald Tam, had a wonderful friendship with your clergy leadership during the time that you all hosted us when we were buildingless, and really helped this community come together. And we're grateful for that history and that relationship. You know, at the end of the day, both of our traditions teach that relationships come by breaking bread together, of sitting and finding our commonalities. We come from, and I would say this as well for the Muslim community, we all come from the idea of monotheism. We all have the same basic foundational start with the call of Abraham. And to be able to sit together and to study together, to study where our commonalities are and where our particular narratives went off on their unique branch. learning from one another about one another is part of that ally building. And, it's hard to hate somebody that, you sit next to and that you've shared personal stories with, and you may not always agree on everything, but at least you've built a relationship. And from that relationship, our hearts are more open. Our minds are less stuck in a particular way of thinking. And so we're much more likely to stand up for one another when we know somebody is in pain, when somebody is in trouble. And so, to rekindle that relationship means that we should come and study together. Let's, as I said, being able to share a meal, which one day I'm hoping in my congregants will share a meal.
Come back.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Meredith, then Carolyn, then Mike, then Amy, in that order. Question.
Thank you. Thank you, Hal. I was struck when I was looking at your bio that you'd spent so much time on the West Coast and Midwest, and I was interested in your move here to our community. And I'm wondering, the South is an area of, considered to be sort of a hotbed of racism and bigotry and so on and so forth. And do you see a difference in your experiences here versus other parts of the country? Are they very similar? Are they different? How has that been for you?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. Hatred and bigotry is everywhere. This idea that otherness is something to be feared, it has been a part of humanity. We certainly know it's been in the Bible, my Bible and yours. I think it's housed differently in different parts of the country. When we lived in Oregon, we lived in Multnomah County, and Multnomah County is this, bastion for liberalism, and the entire county carries the entire state of Oregon. But if you go out into other parts of the state, you got the militias there, and it's scary. It's really scary. You look into the history of Oregon, and I remember when I moved there, I thought, oh, it's so hip and cool, and and kumbaya, and everything's wonderful in Portland. But you go back 75 years. The congregation I was with there was founded before the state was founded. If only I could have been a rabbi back in those days when they preached for 2 hours and people came from all over to hear.
Yeah.
But there was tremendous bigotry. That was a place that was redlined. There were sunset laws. I was horrified to learn about all of that, and that still lives in our country. I think what I've discovered by being in the South is, more and more people sort of are owning the bigotry that is inherent in the South. The fact that we take our confirmation trip, one of our confirmation trips, our students are able to really learn about the history of the South, to learn about the Jewish community's history in the South. And we have to admit, white Jews were on both sides of the Civil War, and we have to own that. And we talk about hatred, we talk about bigotry, we talk about in every manifestation, every form of it. And we try and really evaluate our biases. And I think one of the things that I've discovered here, especially in Atlanta, is on the one hand, we're sort of very proud of our civil rights history here. And on the other hand, we still got a long way to go. And in the suburbs, even more so. I think we have a tendency in the burbs to say we can hide behind our manners. Lots of people have been marching for lots of things, which is a good thing. And we see lots of incidences of hate across the board in our middle schools and in our high schools. And, we need to confront that. But as I said, I think it's everywhere. And, a lot of things have been pulled back. We're seeing a lot of ugliness that's still here. But maybe that's okay that the ugliness has been exposed, because if we see it, we have to deal with it. And we're all people of faith. Our traditions demand of us that we have to encounter. If we want to talk about the devil, that's the devil. That's the ugliness. That's the hatred. That's the thing that's destroying God's world. God put us all here to be our higher selves. God gave us structures by how we are supposed to build a just world, how we are supposed to treat one another, to see the sanctity in the eyes of the other, not to fear the other, but rather to see God in the face of the other. And if we just give lip service to that and we don't act upon it, none of us are fulfilling our theological responsibility of how to walk this earth while we are here. And so, so there's hate and ugliness everywhere, and we're calling it out, and we're getting into the face of that hate. And those of us who are doing the work and walking the walk, it's a long path still forward, but but that's why we're here.
Carolyn.
I forget who was next.
No, it's I'm sorry, it's Carolyn.
I think I'm next.
Yes, Carolyn, go ahead, please.
My question is quite similar to Carol Maddox's, and that is, hers was what do we as a church do, but mine is a question of what do we as an individual do to fight against bigotry, anti-Semitism being one of them.
Yeah. I think it's calling it out. It's not staying silent. Silence is likened to agreeing that it's okay. And anytime that bigotry rears its ugly head, we have to face it, and we have to call it out, and we have to demand a response. There is power. Well, let me phrase it this way. God gave us power. God gave us the responsibility to stand up and call out bigotry. So when we see it in our schools, and I do want to address something about the schools in a moment, but when we see it in our schools, if we see it from our politicians, if we see it from our neighbors, if we see it in ourselves, let's face it, we all have biases, and we've got to be brave enough to look in the mirror, call out our own biases, own them, grow from them, and then use that growth to be able to bring it out into into our public sphere. I am when there was that whole incident, the NASCAR incident 4 years ago, where the noose was hung in in the driver's stall. And I had put something out to my community, and somebody from my community, started, well, you don't really know that's what it was, and how can you say that? And my response to him was, if I'm wrong, but it looks like a noose to me. And if I'm not calling that out, how can you expect me to call out every time there's a swastika that's drawn in a textbook or put on a bathroom wall? There are words, there are phrases, there are symbols, there are acts. And if we're not calling them out, we can't expect anyone to call them out when it's against something that is against us. So, Carol, it's raising your voice. Carolyn, I apologize. It's raising your voice. It's if you read something that you think is wrong, speak up. Write to your congressperson, whatever it is. Don't just, swipe left on your phone or swipe up on your phone or ignore the page, just like and then move on. We have to act. We have to act. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used the phrase, and it's often used, but it's praying with your feet. Prayers are empty if we don't follow it up with action. And, our words are actions. So it's calling it out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mike, you had a question?
Yeah, my mouth's still watering over Bob's double pepperoni there. And I think the second one was a loaded, wasn't it, all the way?
Yes.
Thanks for being, it's great to have one of the chosen people with us. And we hope we're chosen people as well.
We're all chosen for different purposes.
I talked to a rabbi about that one time, and we agreed that you weren't chosen as the special people, you're chosen as God's messengers. And
well, I would add, we've got 613 commandments we're obligated to follow.
Hey, now you're talking about the law.
I think you guys got love your neighbor.
I'm all up on the law. Let's go back to Leviticus and see what's going on. Okay.
Right, exactly.
But Rabbi, you've talked so much about division. You've talked about hate. You've talked about whiteness. You've talked about civil rights hate. Now you talked about the NASCAR guy that had a noose, and then there's so the Jews control the world, and the Jews do not believe in Jesus, and that's why we don't like it. You've talked about hate and division so much, and then what's love got to do with it? How are we going to deal? And then you say, write your congressman, and we've heard that before, by the way, in this space. But what's love got to do with it? Don't go out and, and the criticism is, I just wrote down so many things you talked about, which are division and hate, and we're all, and by the way, the U.S. Constitution, where you said puts white Christian men on top, you missed one word that we heard in the previous session, which is white Christian Episcopal men that are on top in the Constitution. That's what we heard in previous sessions. So you missed that one, Jefferson.
You are right. When
all of us Christian men are the bad guys, white Christian men. So man, you've just given us a litany of things that we can't, and back to Islam and Muhammad and all that went on back there and how all that stuff started. And then you say act. What are you supposed to act on? Last we've heard that we need to act right. Said right to your congressmen and stuff like that. Can't we figure this out ourselves? Our congressmen are idiots. And we're never going to figure it out with those guys being right or left, or we're on your side or that side.
Yeah.
What do we do here?
So I had a wonderful teacher, Rabbi Richard Levy of blessed memory, passed not too long ago. And I remember him teaching when we were studying we're studying a biblical passage. And in the description of the high priest, and all of the garb, the accoutrements that that Aaron and his sons were to wear. The high priest, the Kohen Gadol, was going to wear a band on his forehead that said Kadosh LaAdonai, holy to God. And Rabbi Levi had said, can you imagine if all of us had tattooed on our foreheads, holy to God, how we would engage with one another? The single most important teaching that we share collectively is ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Human beings are given eyes to see, but too often we see one another as distinct and different from ourselves. If we've used our eyes to see the divinity in the face that is across from us, if we saw one another as holy to God, we're all chosen by God. We're all created in the image of God. If we knew that the way in which we acted toward one another had to be from a place of love, how different would our world be? Sadly, however, this idea of otherness has always taken top billing over love. I love my family. I love my inner circle, but you're a potential threat. As I said before, we see that play out over and over in the what you know as the Old Testament. We need to do what we are commanded to do, to care for one another, to love for one another, to Olam chesed yibaneh, that the world will be created from love, from chesed, from righteousness and compassion. So how do we act? Yes, we have to write our congresspeople, all that, but we need to walk up to the stranger on the street and not judge them, but rather to care for them, to love them, to say to them, tell me your story. Let us share a coffee together. That's the only way that we can truly bring about a world of peace. It's the only way it's going to happen in the Middle East. It's the only way it's going to happen with one another. But unfortunately, fear is what drives so many people. I mean, my gosh, that's politics right now. It's fear mongering. It's keeping us divided. We need to say no more. We're going to reach out to one another. We're not going to allow fear to drive us, which is a really scary thing. There you go. It's fear again. It's scary to trust someone that's outside of your inner circle. It's scary to trust somebody that's out of your cohort or your mindset, to see another way of viewing a world. But if we don't sit down and hear each other's stories, to hear each other's pain and fear, we cannot move forward. And friends, I don't know about you, but I look at my beautiful grandchildren and I fear for their future world for a lot of reasons. I love them to death and I want to love everyone around them so that their world is a better world. So bigotry and hatred, it can only stop with each one of us. All of our traditions teach that one person can change the world. You save a life, you save a world. You destroy a life, you destroy a world. So if each one of us says, I'm going to do my part to put love out, to talk to somebody I don't know, to reach out to somebody who I think is different than me, to sit down and get to know them, it's only us that are going to be able to make a difference. That's where the love is.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think, Amy, are you nearby, or are you in earshot? Because you're next. Well,
There she
hello.
is.
Yeah, there she is.
Here she is.
You need to unmute, Amy, to ask your question. Great, wonderful.
Hey, sorry about that.
Amy,
Can
your
I ask
face
a
is so familiar. Have we met?
I don't think so.
Okay. And my community would say we were at Sinai together.
Yeah.
My question is real specific about something, is that in churches where I was before I started coming to St. David's, we would often have a Seder meal at Passover as part of our learning about the Lord's Supper and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And not that long ago, I read an article saying that this was cultural appropriation that was terribly misguided and offensive. And I would hate to think I was participating in something I didn't even realize was an issue. And so I just thought I would bring it up when I had a time to ask.
I appreciate that question. And you don't need to feel sorry for doing that. Sometimes there's a fine line between sharing in other cultural traditions and then subsuming them, creating a synchronistic experience out of something. So participating in a Passover Seder, which in the Jewish tradition, the Exodus from Egypt is our foundational narrative. Everything before that was monotheistic, and then individual relationship building with God. But the Exodus from Egypt, which is this wonderful birth metaphor, really is our foundational narrative, and we are commanded to in every generation, we, the Jewish people, are to see ourselves as if we were personally redeemed from that place by God, in order to reconnect to our covenantal relationship with God. So the experience of the Passover Seder in its full traditional nature is one in which we are reenacting that moment of redemption. The sharing of that tradition with others is something that is beautiful, to be able to experience all of the symbols, the narrative, the learning that comes from that. And oftentimes, I will tell you, I have conducted so many Seders within churches, but I always conduct them as I would conduct it in my own home. Where the appropriation has occurred has been where the concept of a Seder is utilized with a Christian narrative, where the symbols are changed to meet the theological needs of Christianity. So whereas the 4 cups of wine represent the 4 promises God makes in the redemption, the appropriated, changed, take those four cups, and the meaning gets replaced with steps leading to Jesus's coming or Jesus's resurrection or all of those things. So that's where we get a little testy. That the Passover Seder then is completely changed, but leads one to believe that this is what the Seder is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
There are people that will go to Israel and they will, or if you go online and you want to buy talis, there are messianic talises that are out there that I spend a lot of time trying to teach my people how to not buy a messianic talis because it's got quotes about Jesus all over it. But the wearing of a talis, the whole symbol of a talis itself, and I will show you. All my talises are now falling out of my closet, my thing here. So the purpose of a talis is we are told in the Torah that we are to mark our clothing, the four corners of our clothing, with these fringes and tassels and ties and knots. Can you sort of see those knots? Okay. These are symbolic of the mitzvot, the law that we take upon ourselves. It is considered the yoke of the mitzvot that we take upon ourselves as part of the covenant. And Mike, that's where, to be chosen isn't so great because we've got this heavy yoke we're supposed to wear. Okay. So, as my mom always says, to be the firstborn isn't always the best. So for people who are from a messianic viewpoint saying they're wearing the talis with the fringes representing different aspects of Christian teaching, that again, it's appropriating what the purpose is, which that is what we find troubling. And I would assume that if we were to take communion and we were to change the meaning of communion, that would be abhorrent to those who take communion as a sacred sacrament. So that's really what it is. We often invite people to join us for a Seder to experience this whole redemptive piece. Obviously, the connection that, if in fact in Jerusalem, the last meal was a Passover Seder, I can understand that desire to be able to lean into that holy moment for the Christian community, but it should be done from the sense of Jesus would have been doing a
Jewish
Passover Seder at, similar to what we do, which, technically would have been a little bit different because then we had the Talmud and the Talmud added more elements to it. So, so as long as, really this idea of being true to what it is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you.
Sure.
Debbie Beecham. Unmute.
Hi, Debbie.
First of all, I want to tell you how much I appreciate everything that you are sharing. I've been looking for someone who is a leader and has knowledge and shares that knowledge. I was raised Jewish, but I knew nothing of what you were talking about.
Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah, and I went to Hebrew school. I graduated from Hebrew school. I did a bat mitzvah. I went to Sunday school through 8th grade. I did it all, but that was not part. Learning what you're talking about is what I craved knowing. So thank you. Second is I now understand why I feel so much pressure to be such a good person. My bloodline. What I do, I used to teach, and I felt I had to do something since I left teaching. And so I feel I have to be kind to people who are different than me. And so whenever I see someone who is of a different color or a different race, or even just another person who looks like me, I will go out of my way without being intrusive of telling them thank you and asking them, is there anything that you would like to talk about? And I was amazed sometimes how people will come up later and go, I need to talk to you.
Mm.
I sit on a bench after riding my bike with my husband in Piedmont Park and say hello to every person who walks in front of me.
How lovely.
I'm actually shocked at how many people will stop and sit and talk with me. I didn't expect that. And I always felt that that was not something that was that big of a deal. And now listening to you, I think, even if it's small, if I do many small things, it will add up. And I was raised to speak up. When I was teaching, I did a program from the ADL called No Place for Hate.
Ah, yes.
And I used literature to teach about all different kinds of people. And my thing now is with the CRT, with the critical race theory, is breaking my heart, because I would probably be arrested if I was in the classroom. Even though I was not teaching racism and all of that, I was teaching the truth. And so I would like for everyone who is listening here also to please speak up about banning the books, about not allowing teachers to teach. So I'm stealing your platform, but I feel so strongly about this because the work I did was through all socioeconomic levels. And I would like to think that I helped some children to look at others in a different way. And it has to start with children, with adults that are already set in their ways. And it is harder, but that shouldn't stop us from trying to listen to people. I have a son who has completely different ideology than I do. And my husband says, how can you still talk with him and be so thoughtful and loving? And I said, because if I'm not, then that just feeds into how he is with other people. And I will not do that. He's my son. And I want him to know, even though our thoughts are different, I still love him as a person. His ideology, I don't. And we are still talking to each other, which is wonderful. So I encourage everyone to just take one small step every single day. I honestly believe if enough of us do, we don't know what the end result is.
Amen to that, Debbie.
So thank you for letting me speak. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Marilyn?
Marilyn, did you have another question?
Well, not a question, just sort of a meander, a Marilyn's meander. Rabbi, you had said something about you wished we could come together to have a meal together. We have in fact broken bread together. Judaism keeps touching my life in many ways over my many years. And one of the things that I just touched my heart and soul when we moved to Roswell and we were looking for a church, we didn't have to look far, because there was this church not too far from the house that was hosting a gaggle of congregants from a not yet developed temple. And they were having their school at our church for 3 years or something, that Beth Tikvah was forming and was meeting at St. David's. And I just thought, if this isn't the most loving example I have ever seen of a church reaching out to just love, it was just stunning. And then the beautiful gift of the 12 tribes of Israel window. we invited Temple Beth Tikvah to come join us for that communion service after that was installed. And sometime not too long after that, we were invited, St. David's was invited to a Shabbat Shalom at Beth Tikvah after Beth Tikvah was built. And it just was the most beautiful relationship and openness. Many years later, there was a meeting there that was in a time of world and national troubles among major religions that Beth Tikvah hosted an open forum and had speakers from Christian churches, and I don't remember who the rabbi was who was there. I don't think it was Rabbi Tam at that time. I think he had moved on. And there was someone from the Muslim community who was addressing hate and was addressing politics in the world. That trialogue even, is terribly important. And I think that it's amazing that from time to time we've been able to do this. I mentioned that Judaism keeps touching my life. From the time that I was a tiny girl, I was aware of, these were dear friends of my parents up in Connecticut who had been, I never knew the details of it when I was too young to understand, and they didn't share this with me, but I knew that they had had a very, very hard time in Europe and had escaped to the United States at some point during the World War. And for all those years afterward, from the time I was a tiny child until I was into my teens, I remember Mrs. Greenman was always collecting things and always sending things back to Europe for families who needed them.
Yeah.
And I have a friend here who now, this has been 3 or 4 years ago, asked me if I could lend a hand because a doctor that she had worked with and for many years, Dr. Joan Weens, was not able to live in her parents' home any longer. And the home needed to be cleaned out. A tree had fallen through the roof and the roof was covered over, but the house needed to be emptied, and their life's, all the detritus and cherished things of life were in the house. So we spent a couple of days just working at that. And the story behind this family, which touches me so deeply, is that each of them had fled Germany in 1938, in the spring of 1938, when things were getting very bad. And the reason that the parents were able to get out, they were not yet married, is that they had parents or cousins who gave them their traveling passes so they could get out, because the parents knew it was coming. There was virtually no one in the family who survived, but they made it to the United States. They married here. There was a trunk in the attic with certain things in it that spoke so deeply of the dreams that they held that they may or may not ever have gotten to see come true. There were baby garments in there, one blue, one pink. There was a Tales of the Brothers Grimm in German, published in 1938. They were looking to start a life when the world was against them. And it was very moving. And there were so many other things there, letters in German. We turned these things over eventually to, I don't know the proper name of it, but there is, it's the collectors of the Jewish stories and the continuancing of their lives and traditions, that these items we turned over to them so that they could be honored and their stories could be written and not lost. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that. One of the things I just put in the whatever these things are that we wrote, the chat, it's a misattributed quote, usually to Edmund Burke. I don't think anybody's ever figured out who said it, but the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing.
Mhm.
There is so much power
Yes.
in that statement. There is so much weight of thought, and there is so much good to be had if you take it seriously.
Mhm.
Oddly enough, the Temple Beth Tikvah has been an important part of my life for a Christian down the road.
Well,
And I
this has
thank you all.
been,
Thank you for sharing.
thank you, Marilyn. Thank you very much. Meredith?
Mute. Yes. All right. Well, Rabbi, we thank you for coming. This has been a wonderful evening. I think we've all learned a lot. I've learned so much. And we really appreciate you giving us this background and this history and staying with all of our questions and comments. And I hope that we can find a way to get St. David's and Beth Tikvah together and come up with some way for our congregations to sit down and break bread. If that can't happen soon, something to happen soon so that we can build that friendship that was there some years ago. So thank you so much for coming and helping us hopefully get that started.
Thank you so
Appreciate it.
much. It was wonderful being with you all. And I would welcome the opportunity for us to find a way to stay connected and to come together. I am going to send to you, Meredith. I have four books it's a picture. I will send you that you can share with the group that are four very good recent books that talk about specifically about anti-Semitism and for those who are interested in continuing studying in that area. But thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for being here tonight. And if any questions come up, anything about Judaism, feel free to shoot me an email. My bethtikvah.com. That's my email. And you are welcome. My people aren't coming back in the building yet, but I'm open. So if you would like to come for any Sabbath service, feel free. I would love to host you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks, Meredith.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Carlton.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. I
Bye-bye.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Before we break up, I'd like to offer a closing prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with
Also
you.
with you.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this assembly of your creation and pray that we will embrace our differences. You made us in your image and imbued us with the gifts of thought and reason. We pray that we will use these gifts to your honor in respecting the differences among us that you have created. We ask that you give us the strength, the humility, and understanding to respect and accept the brothers and sisters of your creation. We ask that you help us to accept that we are your children, equal in all ways, and striving to love as Christ does, unconditionally. Our prayers offered in seeking forgiveness for the hatred we have harbored in our hearts and the unrighteousness expressed to our fellow beings whom you created, we have insulted you. We are sorry for the insults, the slights, the negative stereotypes that we hold, and the indifference that we have shown to the children of your creation. We ask for your grace in striving to live as Christ did. And we ask this in the precious name of our Heavenly Father, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Carlton.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate everybody coming.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Good crowd.
Thanks, Meredith.
If there's
Thank
any other
you.
questions,
Good night.
I'm going to
Thank you
stop the
very much. Thank you.
recording.
see.